Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on types of microorganisms. Today we're going to take a brief look at some of the broad categories of microorganisms, the types that we'll be talking about in this class throughout the semester. And we're just going to go through a real brief amount of information over each type. I'm going to give you some examples of each type, and then later a lot of this will come up in other chapters with other topics, and you'll see kind of more detail where it applies in later sections. Make sure that you have your lecture guide with you, and if you need a copy, you can find these in the resources page. This one is color, excuse me, and so you can see a color version if you don't have a color version here in the resources page. I'll be using some of the pictures here, but they don't always line up with the text as I'm talking. So make sure that you're kind of looking ahead, and feel free to pull up the web and look for examples because there's lots more pictures than what I have here. So one of the first distinctions we want to make is that microorganisms as a whole can actually be categorized in two broad categories, largely based on whether they are considered living or non-living. So the terms are cellular and acellular. Cellular is a reference to the fact that all the organisms in this list here are made up of at least one cell, and most of them are only one cell. And one of the definitions of life in a living thing is that you have to be at least one cell. So cellular and living are sort of, in that sense, connected. You have to have a cell to be alive. So these are all the cellular life forms that are also microscopic that can be of interest in the class like this. So I'll give you a second here to make sure you have all of those written down. Again, follow along with that lecture guide, and it asks you to write all these in there. You'll see these in the textbook as well, and we'll talk about these in additional lectures. Now, on the other side here, we have acellular. Acellular, again, by contrast, means that we're essentially talking about things that are not technically alive. They don't actually have a full cell. So they, in that regard, are acellular. We'll talk more about what that means in the future, but for now, that's the distinction that we're making. Living on the left, cellular; non-living on the right, acellular. So we're going to start here with some of the cellular creatures, starting with bacteria, and go into some of the details, and we'll go back through all of these here at some point before we're done. So bacteria, one of the things that you want to recognize is that these are organisms that are classified as prokaryotic. So prokaryotic is an organism that has a cell, but is considered more of a simplistic kind of cell. So it's not an advanced cell. And from there, then, we see that when we have a simple cell, we can get energy in a couple different ways. And this applies to the more complex cells as well. But their energy sources can be more essentially from the sun, more or less, photosynthetic. And also, probably more commonly, especially in relation to the human interactions that we have, many of these bacteria are what we call heterotrophic. And what that basically means is that they have to go find energy outside of just getting it from the sun. These are almost always the kinds of bacteria that cause infection and disease. They also do a lot of positive things as well, but when we talk about pathogenic bacteria, they're nearly always heterotrophic. They're going to essentially feed off of our body or animals or other things, and that's where they get into trouble. Gram-positives and gram-negatives, those terms will come up in chapter 4, which we'll do in the next chapter, and you'll see more about the specific characteristics of those two subgroups there. So for now, just be kind of familiar with those. Another thing that you want to recognize about bacteria is they're one of the most, if not the most, common and diverse microorganisms on Earth. There's a term that comes up, and we've already talked about it in a previous lecture, called ubiquitous, means found everywhere. Bacteria are one of the few types of microorganisms that are actually found everywhere, or at least nearly so. And so they're pretty much everywhere you go, for the most part. When it comes to heterotrophic bacteria, like I said, these are what typically are of a concern as far as infection and disease goes. So some examples here, Staphylococcus aureus, which, by the way, is most commonly just referred to as staph in most cases, so staph infection. This is an example of a gram-positive heterotrophic bacteria. Staphylococcus aureus is the full name. By the way, another way that you often hear this is MRSA. MRSA is a form of antibiotic-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So when you're talking about MRSA, you're more or less talking about the same thing. Another common one, which is a gram-negative heterotrophic, is E. coli. Escherichia is the full pronunciation of the E. We often just call it E. coli. So you're probably familiar with those two. If not, now you're hearing about them for the first time. Those are both examples of heterotrophs. So they feed off other things, and that can get them in trouble when it comes to getting into the human body in cases. Now, those often are not harmful, but they can be. Here on the left, we see an example of a photosynthetic bacterium, Spirogyra, and these are the pictures on the right here of our potential pathogens, aureus and E. coli. Archaea is the next example, and archaea are also prokaryotic. So what that means is that they have a simple type of cell, similar to bacteria. Archaea are more unique in that they have more diversity in the way that they can acquire energy. So they can also be heterotrophic, which, like the bacteria, feed off of predetermined organic matter. They basically just feed off of either living or dead things. But they also, archaea can also be a unique category called chemoautotrophic, in which they can actually get energy from an inorganic source, like basic chemicals, hydrogen sulfide being an example here. That is not actually all that medically relevant, which is where I try to keep the focus of this class. But from an environmental standpoint, it has a lot of interesting implications, and archaea kind of make up these weird niches in the environment. For that reason, and others, we are often, the archaea are often referred to as extremophiles. There are other organisms that are also called extremophiles, but what that term means is that they love extreme environments, and they're sort of atypical outside of normal environments. Examples of those extreme environments would be areas with high salt, high acidity, extreme temperatures, high and low. Now that's chemoautotrophic. The idea of being chemoautotrophic isn't something that we're going to spend a lot of time focusing on in this class. But the idea is that when we're talking about briefly these different types of organisms, just recognize that archaea are kind of an outlier. They're extreme. Being chemoautotrophic is one example of why they might be considered that. And for context here, we just kind of want to recognize that that's one of the ways that archaea are often thought of, sort of an extreme example outside the norm. These, as of right now, it's 2024, these are not actually recognized as being pathogenic to humans. The textbook does mention that they are recognized as part of the human microbiome, being part of our body. So we do appear to have them in our body, but not something that causes disease. At least that's not something that we recognize today. Some examples, and then I'll move on, of archaea would be an acid-loving microorganism here, Ferroplasma acidoramus, and a chemoautotrophic example, which is a methane producing. I'm going to actually not try to pronounce that one. But what this is known for is the production of methane, which is actually a greenhouse gas, which is actually a key part of an environmental cycle. So these are examples here of archaea. This is one here that's an acid lover. This is actually discovered in the bottom of a coal mine in Africa, an extreme place to be finding these microorganisms. And then over here on the right, we see some examples of methane-producing microorganisms. All the pictures are kind of low quality. You don't see a lot of really good pictures, but that's the kind of visualization that we often find with these. All right, moving on to the next example, we have our first example here of a eukaryotic cell. So a eukaryotic cell is something that we'll contrast with a prokaryotic cell in more detail in the upcoming lectures. But for now, what we want to just recognize is that prokaryotic, which were the last two examples, are simple. Eukaryotic, by contrast, are more complex, more advanced. And so in that regard, we have a sort of a contrast between the two. Like the prokaryotes, eukaryotes can get energy in a variety of ways. And when it comes to protozoa in particular, these are primarily, if not exclusively, heterotrophic. like some of the organisms that we saw with the bacteria, like Staphylococcus and E. coli, they basically have to go out and find food. They're not able to get it from the sun in the vast majority of cases. Protozoa are actually pretty common. They're not ubiquitous. They're not going to be found everywhere. But if you go into an area with soil that's especially wet soil, water, you'll be pretty much guaranteed to find them. They're also relatively commonly spread by insects, in which they can cause diseases. Um, they can, for example, be spread through mosquitoes and a variety of insects, both in the United States, but more commonly around the world, and even more commonly around the equator and the tropical areas. We don't see a lot of them here in the United States, but they do exist. Um, the majority are non-pathogenic, but for those that are pathogenic, they can cause a variety of issues. A common, relatively non-pathogenic group are called paramecium. You can see paramecium on your handout there. Paramecium are really a variety of common protozoa. Um, Amoeba, we often hear, sometimes I shouldn't say you often, but you hear about amoeba as a sort of generic kind of microorganism. You have another picture there of amoeba proteus on your handout. These are sort of blobby, non-defined shape types of organisms that often exist in moist environments. An example of one that's spread by ticks and that can cause disease, Babesia microti. This one is actually responsible for a disease called babiosis, babiosis. I think that's how you pronounce that. Not common, but it is a tick-borne disease. Another one that you may have heard of is a organism that causes the brain-eating disease, or what's often referred to as a brain-eating amoeba. This one is called Naegleria fowleri. All these tend to have weird names if you haven't noticed. And this is one that is rare, but does get picked up in freshwater environments and can be fatal if the microorganism is absorbed into the brain tissue. Here you see some of those pictures on the handout. Amoeba proteus, paramecium, Babesia microti, which is the tick-borne disease, which is spread, by the way, often through red blood cells and can infect red blood cells. And this is an example, this is actually a real image of the Naegleria brain-eating amoeba with a high-resolution image and a kind of a unique angle that makes it look like some kind of Joker face. But that's actually a real picture. So protozoa are a unique kind of eukaryote that sort of live in the environment and are also spread in a variety of diseases. Moving on here to the next eukaryote here, we have algae that are sometimes referred to as phytoplankton. So maybe you've heard that term before. Algae, phytoplankton, these are also eukaryotic, so they have complex cells. Now, unlike protozoa, which are eukaryotic, algae are going to get their energy from the sunlight almost exclusively. There's always an exception, but as a generality, they almost exclusively are going to feed off of sunlight. They're a lot like a plant in that regard. They're just microscopic. So I often think of algae as microscopic plants. Algae are almost always harmless, but they can actually cause harm in some cases, but more so they're beneficial in a lot of ways. So one of the things about algae is that they are like plants, as I mentioned, and plants are a food source. And in that same regard, algae are a food source. They tend to be one of the main food sources at the very base of the food chain, meaning either the other organisms either feed directly off them or indirectly at different points in the food chain above them. So they're a primary food source is the main takeaway there. Another really key reason why algae are important is that they produce most of the oxygen on Earth. We often think of oxygen coming from trees. Trees being a plant, again, algae are like plants. And so algae, like trees, like plants, they also produce oxygen. And it just turns out in the ocean in particular, there are vast amounts of algae. And so it turns out that a lot of the oxygen on Earth actually comes out of the ocean from algae specifically. The exact amount is somewhat up for debate, but the estimates are around 50%, give or take. About half of the oxygen is thought to come from algae, although that number is up for debate. So some examples here, Corellia, Euglena, diatoms. These are all relatively broad groups, especially in the Euglena and diatoms. So there's a lot of variation, and this isn't a major emphasis for the class. As I mentioned, they don't usually cause disease. They're more of an environmental. They're more environmentally significant. But here you can see pictures. These are more low resolution type pictures. And usually when you see things like pond scum, green sort of stuff floating on the top of a pond, you're seeing large amounts of algae all collected at the top for various reasons. So it's a greenish type of color that you're seeing on the pond, which is the algae. Okay, so the next group here are fungi. Fungi are also eukaryotic, meaning they have an advanced cell type. And fungi are going to be a lot like our protozoa in that they're heterotrophic, meaning they have to go find food. Unlike the protozoa, however, they occur in both macroscopic and microscopic forms. And what we're probably most familiar with are what we would actually consider macroscopic fungi, in other words, mushrooms. So mushrooms have similar but different characteristics in common with the other group, which are called microscopic fungi. These include the yeasts and the molds. So yeast is a specific sort of category of microscopic fungi, and molds are another category of microscopic fungi. There's a lot more detail in these categories, so these are very broad generalizations meant to keep it somewhat short here. So some examples of macroscopic fungi, just things that you've probably seen at some point. There's all sorts of different specific forms, but mushrooms, as I'm sure you've all seen, but to visualize here, what we have is an organism that exists in a form that's actually similar to the microscopic fungi. At the microscopic level, if you were to break these down, they'd actually look a lot like each other, but these become so collectively organized that they grow to larger sizes that become visible to the naked eye. And what you're actually seeing here is the collection of lots of smaller cell structures all sort of pushing to the surface that can then be used to release their spores. So fungi actually usually exist in the soil beneath the ground, but what you're actually seeing here is actually called the mushroom cap, and that pops out under the right conditions in order to release the spores, which you can see here in the microscopic fungi. These little structures here, these little circles and these little circles here, those are the spores of the microscopic fungi, which are pretty similar to these spores of the macroscopic fungi. But the mushroom cap itself allows those to pop up out of the ground and spread. So these are examples over here of macroscopic, and these are examples over here of microscopic fungi. So this is actually a yeast over here, and this over here is an example of the mold. And mold, it would be just like what you'd see growing on your bread. And the truth is, once the mold becomes heavily concentrated in large amounts, it actually becomes visible at that point, although you can't see the specific structures, is what you see here in this diagram. Those are like the equivalent of the mushroom cap. These little structures here called sporangia and sporangiospores. Those are actually like the equivalent of the mushroom cap, but they remain microscopic, and really you can only see those with a microscope. So you kind of see the surface level mold when it's heavily concentrated, but not the detail like you see in the macroscopic. So moving on to the next group here, the helminths. Helminths, one of the last groups of the cellular organisms that we're going to talk about, also eukaryotic. These are actually closest to animals. It's really the only kind of animal technically that we study in microbiology for the most part. Animals are heterotrophic. They have to go get food. They don't get it from the sun. And what's distinct about helminths is they're actually parasitic worms. So a worm is technically an animal. We don't think of it that way, but a starfish is an animal, and a worm is an animal, and a fish is an animal, and insects are technically animals. They're part of the Animalia kingdom is actually what that means. So just technically speaking. So it technically is an animal. And so a helminth is really a parasitic worm. So in microbiology, these become medically relevant. And they're not really that common in the US in today's world. They're around us, but they're not super common. But they're actually very common throughout the world, and are still somewhat significant, even though we don't see them as much as we used to. But the definition of a helminth is a parasitic worm. What makes them interesting is that they can get really big, but they always infect at the microscopic stage. So when they infect someone, they're really small, whether that's an animal or a human. they're microscopic during infection. Now, very often they may stay microscopic depending on the species, but many of them can grow to large sizes and to the point where you can see them. But early on, when you are infected, you'll never know that they're there. So that's what's interesting about them, is they grow inside the host. So some examples here would be the tapeworm, Tania solium. There's a variety of tapeworms here. Another example is Diphylidium caninum. We'll talk about this one in more detail later. These are examples of tapeworms. What they do is they lodge the head or the scolex into the intestinal lining, and then they absorb nutrients across the body here, in which the nutrients from the host are used for sustenance inside the worm. This one here is an example of one that causes heartworms in dogs, Diphalaria. And this is one that is spread by mosquitoes in the U.S., more commonly in the southern parts of the U.S., but they are around here in Kansas. And they're spread at a microscopic stage. The mosquito bites the dog, you never even really know it's there, and then the worm travels to the heart and can grow in the heart chambers and eventually lead to heart failure. And Toxocara canis is another example of a round. This is a slightly different kind of worm. It's called a roundworm. And these are more shed through things like the stool, in which they can be picked up and transmitted that way. So those are just a couple examples of the parasitic worms. We'll come back to some of those in a little more detail later. Next example is our first detail example here of an acellular microbe, which would be viruses. I'm assuming you're all at least somewhat familiar with viruses. But what we want to know about a virus is that it's a non-living infectious particle, sort of owing to the idea of acellular, non-living. And the idea of a virus, what they essentially do is exist. They exist to infect cells. So they're not made up of cells, but they are designed to infect cells. So in that regard, they're often described as non-living infectious particles. And in that context, they derive their energy from the host cells they infect. So what's interesting about a cell is that a cell can make all of its own energy and sustain all of its own metabolic processes so long as it has the right environmental conditions. A virus can't do that on its own, but it can if it can infect the proper host cell. Every virus is going to have its own host cell or range of host cells. So as long as a virus can find a suitable host cell, it can then use the host cell for its own metabolic processes, but it cannot do it on its own. So that's what's interesting, is that they kind of become like a life form once they infect, but outside of that infectious cell, outside of the cell that they have infected, they are not really alive by the definition that we use to define life, by the definitions that we use to define life. Another interesting thing about viruses is we often think of viruses as a human pathogen, but the reality is virtually all life forms on Earth are susceptible to various types of viral infection. For example, bacteria that we mentioned earlier. Bacteria can be infected by a specific group of viruses that only infect bacteria. So there's plant viruses, animal viruses, even more specifically human viruses. There's cat viruses, dog viruses. And then there's bacterial viruses. There's actually a whole range of viruses often associated with different specific groups of organisms. So some of the ones that we're familiar with would be like flu, the flu virus, which is influenza, HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2. And then bacteriophage is not one that you're probably familiar with. These are the viruses rather that infect bacteria. So in the name there, phage means eater, and so the name actually translates to something like eater of bacteria, but that has to do with the way they cause issues for the bacteria. So here you can see some images. Viruses are so small, it's very difficult to see them, but you can see viruses with highly advanced microscopic techniques. And these are not something that we can even do at our college, but can be done in sophisticated labs. So here you have a picture of an influenza virus. This is a picture here of a bacteriophage. We'll talk about more of those later. They almost look like a little spaceship. And then this is an illustration. I've yet to find an actual picture of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but the best I can find as of this moment is an illustration. So you can see that the illustration, it's actually somewhat like an influenza virus, although distinctly different. Last example here, our last example is an acellular microorganism. These are prions, prions, preons. Prions are very interesting. They don't even require energy, so they're even less complicated than a virus, which is relatively simple. And what a prion is basically a protein that causes misfolding in other proteins. And so it's a hard one to explain, and today is not, the goal isn't to fully understand these, but just to sort of lay out some basic details here. Prions are essentially proteins that cause misfolding in other proteins, and thus, and as a result, can lead to disease. So what happens is the proteins associate with the central nervous system, and so if you're exposed to these infectious proteins, these prions, if you get them into your central nervous system, like brain and your spinal cord tissue, they can then start to affect other normal proteins in that area and cause those proteins to start to misfold. And then, like a domino effect, they'll cause misfolding in other proteins. So what you end up with is the introduction of proteins that cause a cascading effect on other proteins around them. And I know that's not going to be sufficient to fully understand that, but the idea here is that they're an acellular type of microorganism, infectious, and they are essentially proteins that cause abnormalities in the body by causing other proteins to misfold. Now, in the context of human disease, and where these are essentially relevant throughout the animal kingdom, is that they cause nervous system failure. So the way that they misfold proteins has to do with the nervous system. So this leads to a sort of a general but somewhat specific kind of disease in which the nervous system begins to fail. The form that is found in humans is called Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, sometimes called CJD for short. This is not something that's always fully understood, but it can be diagnosed, and when we find a diagnosis of a prion disease, that's the term that we give it. There's actually a form that's found in cows that was fairly large in the headlines about 20 years ago in the early 2000s called mad cow disease. This is a prion disease in cows. This is called bovine spongiform encephalopathy, more technically. And there's another one that's making some headlines, in fact, just recently, and for the last several years at least. Chronic wasting disease, CWD, is a prion disease that's spread through deer, elk, and moose, and is a concern because it can harm wild deer populations, and is also some concern that one day it may be spread to humans, although as of now, there's no evidence that that is happening. So prions are the last example here. So go back through some of the images and look back over that. You can look through the first chapter of the textbook, and you'll see a little bit more about each of these. Figure 1.4, for example, has some pictures for you there. But otherwise, we'll go into more detail about these in upcoming lectures. That's all for now.